Welcome to the video. If you're excited for what's coming up, give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe. And let's dive back into the story. Suho stood tall, an unshakable force, with his shadow army assembled behind him like an impending storm. The battlefield was moments away from erupting into chaos. Across from him, the Iterum Apostle's lips curled into a sinister grin, unable to suppress the thrill surging within him at the sight of Suho and his spectral legion. A system window materialized before Suho, flashing an urgent notification. His gaze flickered to the quest description, and his expression darkened as the words registered. Defeat Lee Min-sung, who has been possessed by the Iterum Apostle, and obtain his memories. His grip tightened. So it's come to this, he thought grimly. There was no room for hesitation. Another opponent, another life he had to take. His eyes lifted, locking onto the Apostle ahead of him. Yet another person I must kill. The Apostle stood motionless, his sword pointed at Suho. But inside, his mind was in turmoil. Ever since he had begun understanding emotions, an unsettling transformation had taken root within him. When he still couldn't fully comprehend, memories of Jinwoo, the original Shadow Monarch, resurfaced in his mind. The fragments of the main body, that lingering sensation. He pondered, his thoughts dipping into the abyss. I think I finally understand what it was like to meet with darkness. His mind replayed the moment. The overwhelming presence of a being who had shattered an entire dimension's army on his own. He had watched Jinwoo stand alone, surrounded by his forces, yet there was something about him. Something eerily solitary. His glowing yellow eyes flickered as a new thought took hold. Could this kid, Suho, give me the answer I seek? Before he could dwell on it further, a monstrous roar split the air. The venom-fanged serpent, Kasaka, lunged at him with lethal intent. Yet, the Apostle didn't flinch. He stood his ground, watching the beast hurtle toward him. Then, in a single, effortless arc of his sword, he cleaved Kasaka clean in half. The massive creature's bisected remains fell past him, its two halves collapsing to either side like broken puzzle pieces. The Apostle remained still, unfazed, his sword dripping with the creature's lifeblood. But then, from the corner of his vision, he noticed something movement. From within the gaps of his feathers, realization struck. He's fast. A flicker of surprise crossed the Apostle's face as Suho came rushing at him with incredible speed. Not content to let his army do all the work, he was charging in himself. Suho's fist rocketed forward, a strike infused with all his might. The Apostle barely managed to intercept it with his sword, but Suho wasn't done. Blow after blow rained down in a relentless barrage, each punch packed with crushing force. The Apostle met every strike with his blade, his expression shifting into something far more serious. He used his soldiers to distract me, and now he's engaging me in close combat himself. His eyes narrowed. He must be confident in his hand-to-hand skills. Then, in the middle of the exchange, he saw an opening in Suho's defense. His instincts kicked in, and with a precise slash, he aimed to cut Suho down. But at the very last second, Suho twisted his body backward, narrowly evading the lethal arc of the blade. The sheer force of the Apostle's attack didn't go to waste, though. It effortlessly sliced through the massive shadow centipede behind Suho, splitting it in half as if it were made of paper. Before the Apostle could press his advantage, his senses flared. Another presence was closing in. Essel. She darted toward him from behind, her spear poised to strike. Her grip was tight, her eyes alight with fierce determination. This was her moment. With a sharp breath, she swung her spear at full force, gritting her teeth as she aimed to pierce through him. But at the last possible moment, the Apostle tilted his head slightly, letting the weapon graze past him. Before she could recover and strike again, his hand lashed out like a viper, seizing the shaft of her spear in an iron grip. Essel's breath hitched. She struggled, trying to wrench it free, but his strength was overwhelming. She dangled in midair, still gripping her weapon, powerless against his hold. A dark, twisted smirk crept across the Apostle's face as his voice dripped with cold amusement. You're not one of the black soldiers. Essel's breath hitched as she stared at the Apostle, pure terror seizing her. She was completely vulnerable. Her weapon, held captive. Her body, suspended midair with no way to defend herself. Just as panic threatened to take over, Suho came crashing in like a thunderbolt. With a force that could shatter stone, he launched himself forward, his body coiled like a spring, and delivered a devastating kick straight to the Apostle's face. The impact was fierce. Essel was instantly freed from his grasp, but the Apostle barely budged. His head snapped back ever so slightly, but to him, it was nothing more than an inconvenience. Slowly, he turned his gaze back to Suho, his yellow eyes gleaming, narrowing with an unmistakable fury. His voice came out firm, almost scolding. "Why aren't you making proper use of the black soldiers in the main fight instead?" Suho frowned, momentarily thrown off. What does he mean? The apostle's words didn't quite make sense to him, but his expression hardened as realization dawned. With cold determination, he locked eyes with the apostle and spoke in a voice laced with resolve. "Black soldier? If you want to see it so badly, then I'll show you." Without warning, two massive shadowed hands erupted from the ground, gripping the apostle in an iron hold. It was Shaka, one of Suho's elite monsters, who had seized him almost instantly. The sands around them reacted, twisting and coiling as they surged toward the apostle's body, binding him further. The apostle turned his head, finally acknowledging the beast restraining him. Shaka's grip tightened. The weight of the surrounding sand pressed down, locking him in place. But the apostle's expression didn't waver. His sharp, piercing gaze shifted back to Suho, who was already in motion. This was the moment Suho had been waiting for. Gathering every ounce of power at his disposal, he clenched his fist, muscles coiling like a loaded spring. A deep, pulsing energy surrounded him as he reared back, preparing for a devastating blow. The sheer force of his power cracked the air around him. Yet, despite the impending attack, the apostle didn't flinch. He didn't even attempt to break free. He stood motionless, his cold expression unwavering, as if he had no reason to be concerned, as if Suho's attack was beneath him. And then, impact! Suho's fist crashed into the apostle, detonating like a missile. The force of the blow sent shock waves rippling across the battlefield, an eruption of power that tore through the ground. Dust and sand exploded outward in a violent storm, momentarily blinding everything in its path. Suho instinctively shielded his eyes from the debris, but before he could even catch his breath, boom! The sand that had encased the apostle exploded outward, releasing a blast of energy so fierce it sent Suho skidding backward. He gritted his teeth, digging his heels into the ground to steady himself, his heart pounding. His thoughts raced, the sand holding him just shattered. But how? From within the swirling chaos of sand and dust, two piercing yellow eyes gleamed like twin suns, cutting through the haze. Then in a flash, the apostle lunged. His movement was instantaneous, too fast to react to. "I guess I won't be able to feel that same exhilaration I did back then," he muttered in a voice devoid of excitement. Suho barely managed to cross his arms in front of him to block the attack. But even then, the force behind it was staggering. His muscles strained, his body bracing against the sheer impact. But the apostle wasn't done. Without a moment's hesitation, he flickered away at terrifying speed, reappearing behind Essel and the shadow troll monster standing in Suho's ranks. Slash! A cry of pain tore through the battlefield. Essel gasped as a deep gash split across her shoulder, her spear shattering into fragments. The shadow troll barely had time to react before multiple holes were torn through its body, its form barely holding together. Suho's breath caught in his throat, his eyes widened, scanning the battlefield in alarm. He tore through them just like that? But his attention was yanked elsewhere. He felt it, the pressure against his fists, his Vulcan gauntlets cracking. He looked down, and dread curled in his stomach. The gauntlets, his trusted weapons built to withstand monstrous blows, had begun to fracture. Tiny cracks spiderwebbed across their surface, proof of the sheer disparity in power between him and the apostle. A bitter realization settled in. Am I really this outmatched? The apostle turned back to Suho, surveying the damage he had effortlessly inflicted. His expression, once neutral, was now shadowed with disappointment. He let out a slow, measured breath before speaking. How disappointing. His tone carried a weight of disdain, as if he had expected far more from this battle. The soldiers of darkness. They were veterans, warriors with their own will. They moved like a trained army, a force worthy of their reputation. His gaze hardened, and he looked at Suho with something bordering on pity. Your power may be similar to his, but it's completely different at the core. And despite wielding authority, you still can't win this fight. His voice turned sharper, colder. You're far too weak. Suho stood, battered, his body aching, his breathing uneven. But hearing those words, hearing the apostle coldly dismiss his strength, made something deep inside him ignite. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. Damn it. It's gotten so much harder to fight Lee Min-sung ever since he got possessed by the apostle. His strength, a bitter thought echoed in his mind. He's probably on par with an S rank now. But before Suho could even finish his thought, the apostle didn't wait. He charged, his expression twisted into pure rage, his golden eyes burning with fury. A deep frown settled on his face as he stormed forward, his voice cold and sharp. The reason darkness looked lonely was because there was no other existence in this world that could rival him. With that, his sword came crashing down. Suho barely managed to raise his Vulcan gauntlets in time, blocking the devastating strike. But the apostle didn't relent. He pressed forward, his attacks relentless, his words slicing just as deep. There's no way for others to understand someone who is overwhelmingly strong. After all, steel clashed against steel as Suho struggled to hold his ground, his mind racing. What is he talking about? Father looked lonely? The moment of distraction cost him. The apostle's blade came down again, but this time, something happened that froze Suho to the core. Crack! His Vulcan gauntlets, his prized weapons, his trusted armor, fractured. The cracks spread like lightning, splitting apart the enchanted metal. Shatter. In an instant, they were gone. The gauntlets exploded into useless fragments, disintegrating before his eyes. And then, as if to drive the horror deeper, a system notification appeared. System message. The item Vulcan horn has been destroyed. For a second, Suho just stared, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Destroyed? Just like that? That single moment of shock sealed his fate. The apostle saw the opening. Before Suho could react, the apostle's sword tore through the air. The blade plunged deep into Suho's torso. A sharp gasp escaped his lips as agony exploded through his body. He felt the cold steel buried inside him, the sensation surreal, like his own body had betrayed him. Blood poured from his mouth, the metallic taste thick on his tongue. Suho! Essel's voice rang out, raw and desperate. Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to move, to reach him. But her body was broken, unable to help. She could only watch, helpless, as Suho stood impaled. The apostle's gaze darkened, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. You have no clue about the power you possess. But inwardly, his thoughts ran deeper, darker. That's why I'll take it from you. His grip tightened on the hilt of his sword. I'll strip you of the authority of darkness. I'll break you, remake you into a believer. And then, I'll do whatever it takes to claim that power for myself. With chilling determination, he twisted the blade and pushed it in deeper. Suho's vision blurred. Every nerve in his body screamed in agony as he instinctively gripped the sword, trying to stop it from piercing further. But the apostle's strength was suffocating, crushing. His arms trembled under the pressure. The apostle's thoughts continued. Once I do that, I should finally be able to understand how darkness felt, right? Suho's breath came in ragged gasps, his body failing, his strength slipping. Blood dripped from his lips as his fingers trembled against the cold steel. And then, a single thought clawed its way into his mind. I have no clue about the power I have. Lee Min-sung's words echoed from the past. Come to think of it, he said something similar. The memory resurfaced. That battle with Lee Min-sung. His opponent's voice, mocking yet strangely prophetic. You're just a hopeful character with no real personality. You don't even know what you want. Eventually, you'll be forced into a situation where you'll have to make a real choice. Suho's breath hitched. His grip on the sword tightened. His mind, in the midst of pain, started racing down another path. My stats, my skills, are they really enough? Or is there something else I need to become stronger? Then another memory surfaced at a casual moment. Baru, casually munching on popcorn, turned to him with an amused grin. Young monarch, why don't you use the shadow-transformed weapons? Suho had replied with a cool indifference. Vulcan's horn has more attack power. Besides, it's already tough enough managing both my bond skill and the authority of the ruler while commanding my shadow soldiers. Adding another layer of complexity just isn't worth it. Baru, unfazed, had simply smirked. You're a genius. You can do it. Baru, guarantee it. Suho had dismissed it then, his tone cold and unwavering. It's fine. Besides, didn't you say my father never used shadow transformation in battle? There has to be a reason for that. Even if I had used it, I doubt things would have turned out differently. Baru had studied him for a moment, then simply shrugged. If that's what you believe, then I suppose it can't be helped. As the pain of his wound throbbed through his body, Suho's mind drifted into deep contemplation. When did I start doing this? When did I start setting limits for myself so easily? A memory surfaced. A different time, a different Suho. He saw himself before his awakening, before power, before battles, before the weight of the world settled on his shoulders. He was drawing, his fingers gliding across the paper, lines becoming shapes, shapes becoming something more. And then failure. A mistake. A stroke in the wrong place. And just like that, he had given up, setting the sketch aside, telling himself he'd try again later. My habit of compromising after failing, that existed even before I awakened. His eyes widened slightly as the realization hit him. Now that I think about it, I haven't drawn a single picture since awakening. I used to love it, really love it. His fingers twitched, as if trying to recall the feeling of a pencil in his grasp. Then, Lee Min-sung's voice echoed in his mind. You don't even know what you want. Suho exhaled sharply. Yeah, he was right. He had left his meeting with his father up to the system. He had convinced himself that finding his mother would eventually happen when he got stronger. He had kept moving forward, but never once had he asked himself why he wanted that strength. I keep chasing power because I feel like I have none. Then a new thought struck him. Why have I been trying so hard to follow in my father's footsteps? Father doesn't need a copy of himself. I need to find it, something that only I can do. A small, almost imperceptible smile crept on his Suho's lips. Then he acted. With every ounce of willpower left in his battered body, he lifted his trembling hand, his fingers curling slightly, just enough for him to whisper 2 words through his blood-stained lips. Arise! The apostle's golden eyes narrowed as he frowned. Come to think of it, he muttered, his gaze fixed on Suho. The black shadows are immortal, aren't they? No matter how many times they fall, they just rise again. His expression darkened, irritation flashing across his face. Just as he spoke, movement stirred from the depths of Suho's shadow. The dark void rippled like a living entity as monstrous forms began to emerge, rising from the abyss. The apostle gritted his teeth. But no matter how many times your soldiers come back, they'll never be strong enough to defeat me. But then, something changed. The shadows that emerged were different. Back in his true body, the apostle's eyes widened slightly, his breath hitching. They're merging. For the first time, there was a flicker of genuine surprise on his face. Even in the war against darkness, I've never seen this happen. A chimera. Before his eyes, Suho's shadow soldiers fused into a monstrous, nightmarish being. Its form twisted and warped, multiple creatures becoming one, their combined power crackling in the air like an ominous storm. And Suho did something shocking. He severed his bond skill with Gray. Essel gasped, her eyes widening in disbelief as she saw Gray and Suho's fusion suddenly unravel. Why would he do that now? But just as confusion took hold, something even more shocking happened. Suho's aura, already ominous, already otherworldly, grew darker, deeper. It surged around him like a living force, swirling violently as if responding to something unseen. His eyes, they gleamed a brilliant, almost terrifying blue. Shadows crept over his body, coiling around his form like a second skin, like armor forged from the abyss itself. It wasn't just power. It was realization. It was awakening. And everyone watching felt it. For the first time, Suho wasn't just wielding the power of darkness. He was becoming it. We got plenty more where that came from. Hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for even more amazing content.